Good evening and welcome. I'm Maria Kelly, the Curatorial Assistant for Photography here at the High Museum, and I'm the co-curator for the current exhibition, Underexposed, Women Photographers from the High Museum, which inspired tonight's panel. Thank you for joining us. Tonight's program is part of our Conversations with Contemporary Artists series, which is generously supported by the Jane F. and Clayton F. Jackson Conversations with Contemporary Artists Endowment. Underexposed, Women Photographers from the High Museum is made possible by our premier exhibition series sponsors, benefactor exhibition series sponsors, ambassador exhibition series sponsors, contributing exhibition series supporters, and other generous supporters. I would also like to thank the High Museum members who are in attendance this evening. You guys are great. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you're not yet a member of the High, or if you need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this talk. For those of you who haven't had an opportunity to see Underexposed yet, to give you a little bit of background, the exhibition traces the history of photography through the work of women photographers in the High's collection. With 100 works on view by more than 80 artists on view, ranging from the very beginning of the medium in the mid-19th century to the present day, there's truly something for everyone. We're excited to have 3 artists from Underexposed join us for tonight's conversation. We have Megan Riepenhoff, Myra Green, and Joni Sternbach. For a little bio, first we have Megan Riepenhoff. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Megan is an artist based in Bainbridge Island, Washington, and San Francisco, California. She creates cyanotypes in collaboration with the landscape, inviting the elements to inscribe themselves onto her materials. Her work is held in the collections of many museums, including the High, the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, the Albright Knox, the New York Public Library, and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Her exhibitions include the High, Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, the Denver Art Museum, Crystal Bridges, and the Aperture Foundation, among many other museums and galleries. She is the recipient of the Fleischhacker Foundation grant, was an artist in residence at the Banff Center for the Arts, and is a Guggenheim Fellow. Megan published Literal Drift plus Echotone with Radius Books in 2018 and is currently working on a book titled Ice, her next Radius book with text by Rebecca Solnit. Next up, we have Myra Green, who uses a diverse photographic practice and fabric manipulations to explore representations of race and the body. At the center of her practice is a consideration of how our understanding of color is completely dependent on context, materially, culturally, and historically. Her recent body of work uses African textiles as a material and pattern, as well as a color as medium to explore her own relationship to culture. Myra was born in New York City, where she's joining us from tonight, and received her BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and MFA in photography from the University of New Mexico. She is a professor of photography and the chair of the Department of Art and Visual Culture at Spelman College here in Atlanta. Her work is in the permanent collection of many museums, including the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Princeton University, and the Studio Museum in Harlem. She has been featured in exhibitions and galleries and museums, including the New York Public Library, Duke Center for Documentary Studies, the Williams College Museum of Art, Museum of African Diaspora, in San Francisco, and the Sculpture Center in New York City. Myra was just named last month the South Arts Fellow for the state of Georgia for 2021, and she received an Illinois Arts Council Fellowship in Photography and has completed residencies at Lightwork in Syracuse and the Center of Photography at Woodstock. And last but not least, Joni Sternbach. Joni uses large format cameras and early photographic processes to explore the present day landscapes and to make environmental portraits. Her work centers on our relationship with water. Her long-term projects involve the pursuit of understanding the American West and the series Surfland, which captures portraits of surfers in tintype. Joni received her BFA in photography from the School of Visual Arts and an MA from New York University and the International Center of Photography, where she taught for over a decade. She's an advisory board member and founding faculty at Penumbra Foundation in New York, where she currently teaches. Sternbach's work is held in many international and public collections. Again, the High Museum, LACMA, National Portrait Gallery in London, Nelson Atkins Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, Joslin Museum, and MoCA Jacksonville. She is the recipient of several grants, including the New York Foundation for the Arts, CAPS, and the Santo Foundation. Now, After those glorious biographies, without further ado, let's begin tonight's conversation. And if anyone watching has questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and we'll save time at the end to answer them. I've asked each artist to do a little presentation on their work just to kick it off so that their processes are more easily understood right off the bat. So Megan, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Oops, 1 second. There we go. Well, first of all, thank you so much to everyone for coming out tonight. And thank you to the High for having all of us and for putting together this exhibition. I grew up in Atlanta, and so I have really fond memories of going to the High as a child. And the first piece of art that stands out in my mind was this amazing Calder sculpture that was out in front of the museum for years and years. And it's just always really sweet and moving to be back at my hometown museum, even if we're just here on Zoom. So I make cyanotypes in collaboration with elements from the environment to make very literal photographs of the landscape. So the piece that's on the screen right now, this is a piece that I made at Lake Allatoona, Georgia. And at the crux of my practice are questions around manipulation and use of traditional photographic processes in pursuit of making kinds of images that I haven't seen before. I also consider impermanence, the implications of how photography shifts our experiences as humans, a fascination with wildness and chance, and a desire to make images that probe a set of questions around the great mystery in which we exist. Many of you have heard of or seen works by Anna Atkins, who made the first photography book and who worked with cyanotype to make beautiful photograms. So where Atkins was obtaining specimen of seaweed from the shoreline, drying those specimen, putting them onto cyanotype paper, exposing them in the sun, and washing them in the water, I had the urge to work with that same process because I felt that cyanotype represented the earliest relationship of photography to the shoreline. But I wanted to approach the process in my own way and to make the landscape both the subject and the process of the photographs. And from this investigation came my series Literal Drift and several sister series, which I'll talk a little bit about tonight. But these works are all made in collaboration with waves, wind, rain, sand, sediment, ice, precipitation, and etc. The process is a mixture of chaos and control, oftentimes a lot of chaos. It's very rooted in an inquiry around the complicated relationship that humans have to our surrounding environment, both built and not built. The process is intrinsically tied to the work, right? Where the environment is what I am imaging and I'm using the environment to image it. Here's a couple of installation views from a solo show of mine called Echotone at Yosemite Gallery in 2019. Over time, I've grown my list of collaborators, originally starting with waves, but expanding it to work with lakes, rivers, waterfalls, and all kinds of precipitation, as I mentioned. Where Literal Drift collaborates with surface water, sister series Echotone, which you're seeing an example of here, collaborates with precipitation. So I oftentimes use geologic terms to title my work and to address my work, both because I find them fascinating and because I think that they help point to time, specifically geologic time, which is a really interesting way for us to relativize our experiences as humans in the massiveness of history and the massiveness of the future time that is to come after us. So literal drift is a geologic term used to describe the action of wind-driven waves moving sand and sediment along a shoreline. And it's something that we can see when you go to the beach, you'll see it happening, but it's also something that's happening on a really much larger time scale. It's something that's radically beyond our control, and it's something that occurs over millennia. An ecotone is defined as a place where two discrete environments meet in the landscape. Between mountains and plains, one finds foothills. which can be described as an echotone. But what interests me about this term is that it really describes the human tendency to delineate and categorize and try to describe the wild, the world around us, which is not in fact made up of separate components of land, but rather a series of gradually changing landscapes that come together to make up a very complicated and rich ecosystem. This is a project called Chronographs, and chronographs have a lot of similar through lines as literal drift and echotone. But in this work, I also thought about the exhibition as a generative space. So I treated paper with cyanotype chemistry, left it unexposed, and then hand-bound accordion books. And these books are exhibition specific. So there's one page for each day of the show that they're in. So each day, the gallery or the institution turns the book to a new page. And what happens is the pages start to expose according to what's going on in the exhibition space. So time is really embedded in this work. There's the time of the exposure. There's the time where weather occurred. There's the duration of the exhibition. And then of course, there's the idea that books are inherently time-based materials, right? They're experienced collaboratively as someone moves through them and determines kind of how they operate in time. This is another piece that is from an exhibition specific series, and this is a title chart. This piece responds to the tides of the San Francisco Bay. So there's one element or one strip as you see them for each day of the exhibition. In this case, there's 49 days in the show, so 49 pieces of paper. And what happens is each day the gallery pulls the element down off the wall and they cut it to represent the highest and lowest tides of the day as predicted by the National Atmospheric and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So like the chronograph, title charts change throughout the show. And I was also thinking about these larger cycles that are going on around us, right? We have our hopes and our dreams and our exhibitions and our failures and our highs and our lows and all of our events in our human lives. And all the while, the tides just continue their patterns. So from the earliest photographic works, people have been encountering the issue of fixing or stopping an image to preserve it on a page. My works are intentionally only partially photochemically processed, meaning they continue to respond to environments that they encounter over time. I really wanted to push back against this idea of a photograph as a static image and the notion that images are somehow required to be archival and therefore exempt from the very nature of life itself, which is change and ultimately death. So what you're seeing here, these are details from my new series, Ice, which Maria mentioned is coming out as a book in September with Rebecca Solnit as the writer. And I was really excited to get to kick around ideas in this series with such an interesting thinker. Rebecca's really fascinating to speak to. And in talking about impermanence around this work, we talked a lot about the idea of freezing something in ice or freezing it in a photograph or freezing it in time. And also about the utter impermanence of ice, right? Which is both incredibly fragile and incredibly solid. How ice can both harm and heal, and how water shifts shapes and actually becomes a mineral once it freezes. We also talked about the patterning of water as it shifts shapes and the wonder of these formations that are going on in the environment around us. I'm going to play a video here. Okay, so I've been really fortunate over the years to make images in a lot of different places. And like all of you, I was totally floored by the impact of the pandemic. And we decided in the studio to start a one-a-day piece on the first day that Washington mandated the state-ordered lockdown, the stay-at-home orders. When I started this piece, I naively thought it would be like a few months. And here we are over a year out. I have high hopes that this piece will end soon. But what was interesting for me was that the piece started as this kind of individual nod to repetition and stasis and being in the same landscape over and over again, which is not something that's always part of my practice. I want to mention here that we were in a privileged position because I was able to work from home. My husband has been able to work from home. We were not out trying to keep the food chain going or chasing down PPE, trying to take care of people who were dying in hospitals. And so while the piece originally felt like it was about this stasis that we were experiencing, as it's grown through the pandemic, it's felt to me like much more of this collective way that time has been so strange in this moment for so many of us. In our family, like many of your families, we experienced tragedy and loss during the pandemic. And I, at one point, decided that I didn't feel able to continue on with the piece, and my partner took over and he started making the piece. And to me, that speaks to the unforeseen and unexpected gifts that can come in life, despite really difficult conditions in which we find ourselves. So I've imagined this piece, which is called "This Is What Time Looks Like," installed in such a way that someone can walk through it, passing each day, passing this row piece by piece, and kind of have some sense of how strange and disconcerting this lockdown time has been. So as I mentioned, hopefully a piece will end soon, but for now we're still making it. We intend to stop it when we enter the final phase of reopening here. And I'm going to wrap up now and pass the mic to Myra. I'm so excited to hear Myra and Joni speak and learn more about your work. And again, thank you everyone for your attention and attendance tonight.
Thank you, Megan. That was wonderful.
Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. My video wants to come on, it wants to come off. There I am. Hello, everyone. Megan, that was wonderful. I've always been intrigued by your work and just sort of how you engage with time and the beauty that there are things that people forget that photography does very well, and how you engage time as this longer duration. And I think that that's, I really have always enjoyed work that sort of picks at sort of the influences of photography, not the instant, but the influences and the bigger language. So I've always appreciated that about your work. I haven't told you that yet, but just wanted you to know. And in your middle of your presentation, I was like, oh, I should add things to mine. And so I've been twerking in the background some additional images. So I'm going to share my screen shortly. I'm Myra. I'm going to be talking about a project called Undertone, which is a process, ambrotypes on glass plate. So similar to Joni, it's wet plate collodion, which is a historic process. And I think what's interesting about all of us is how we engage in alternative methods of making a photographic image. So if you give me a moment, I will share my screen. I just have to make it work, and it will work because I have asked it kindly to do so. So 1 second, please. Share. Thank you. View. Nope. There we go. So this is from a project titled Undertone, and this is the piece that's up at the High Museum right now. And these images are taken from the first show I had of the work, which was actually in Chicago, where I used to live. I now live in Atlanta, but I'm officially from New York City, so why I'm here now. But this was a part of a show called Minor Chord. And what I've always loved about my work is that even though it's photographs, they are very difficult to photograph themselves as objects or as images. And to me, there's an odd reward in that lack of visibility. So I've been thinking a lot about my work because this was a really important time for me in 2017 and 18 as I transition or use photography and start using textiles at the same time, and thinking about ideas of perception and ideas of color. And so what you see, I hope you can see, is there's a faint photographic image that's set on top of stained glass. And the glass has a lot of different colors, and we'll see, well, actually we won't see because those images fell out, but that's okay. Well, you can see here sort of that red hue underneath in the shadow of the image. And so what's happening is that you start to see the markings of my face. All of the images in Undertone are self-portraits. They're wet plate collodion that I've done with no assistance. There's no one else in the darkroom while I make them. And so it's a process of being producer and model at the same time. And what becomes interesting is that image becomes faint, it becomes ghostly. And I think about this is all happening before George Floyd, but still in a moment where I'm teaching at a new college, an historical Black college and university, really thinking about how to bring photographic practices to a liberal arts education, but also thinking about like how photography provides visibility and invisibility at the same time. So I've always loved the clear pieces in this work because in photographic history, the clear glass plate is what was used to then make photographic images, but has its own value. And so I was excited when the High was interested in this piece because it included one of those clear pieces inside of it. So to go back just a little bit, there are a few pieces, and this one, it's easier to show sort of what is happening in these images, again, self-portraits, and they are sort of small sections of my face, and they refer to Bertillon charts, which sort of are the precursor to mugshots or classifications, and sort of looking at the shape of one's face to help delineate information. And so it's with that I was interested in that in an older project, which I'll show you shortly. But when I came back to this process of wet plate collodion, I really became interested in how that color can influence a reading, or how does color influence a reading of any type of material. So it is not just the object itself. Here you can see this is made on purple glass, but it's also considering its housing. So originally these were singularly housed in a frame, right, in a sort of traditional photographic presentation. And you could tell that the presentation modes would change if one was presented in white frames or in black frames. But there was something very tight, I guess is the word I would use, very closed about these things. I'm a person who likes to touch things and see things, and I make projects. I mean, the first iteration of this, they're at the High, they're lovely and they're encased so no one can touch them. But in some ways I'm like, no, everyone can come play with a piece of glass. And museums don't like that so much, but I understand that. So this first iteration in framing really looked at the individual object and sort of didn't really allow a grouping or understanding relationships to one another. And so I think I'm really happy with just a simple change of framing really changes sort of the perception, which is of course something I'm interested in, of how the piece can be read. So these are the earlier works that I talked about before, which I had done. These are 4 pieces from a project called Character Recognition, which was my first entree into wet plate collodion. And but these were made specifically on black glass. And so there were the colors inferred were really just the nature of the process itself and the black glass. And some notes about process. You can sort of see over here, there's like a half moon shape, which is my thumb holding the glass as I coat it with collodion before it is sensitized in a silver bath. And then the photograph is made while the plate is still wet. So it's a very individual image. I'm a person who also is deeply in love with, fascinated by materiality. And so the other beautiful part of these processes is that you make a one-of-a-kind object. And so I mean, these are reproducible in some ways on the internet, but I don't think they imagined the internet in 1884, right? They just didn't imagine it. So I really like the idea, the same way I believe Megan plays with duration. I really like materiality and objectness as a singular focus as to how photography can function, even though that's not how it functions for most. And I think there's a great beauty to play with that. So to go back one more stage, it's like, why was I attracted to this in the first place? And I think there's a whole historical language around daguerreotypes and cyanotypes, and really thinking about qualities of light and how light is captured. To me, an important part and often not discussed part of photo history is that lights, the light sensitivity range wasn't really made for Black skin or rendered Black skin in a very specific way. And so when I first learned of these processes and I first made portraits of myself, I was thinking of these images of J.T. Zealy, of Drana and Renty. And even though these are a totally different process, daguerreotypes made with mercury, there's something about, we have to remember that photography records on a spectrum that is, that could be biased. I think a lot of that bias has been driven out in the last 30 years. But I think that is something to remember, that a process still comes with bias, right? The same with a lot of different things. And so I always like to bring that up. If you want to learn more about these images, I believe they're still at Harvard and under major litigation, and we could talk about that later. And just because Maria brought it up and there were more slides and I just dumped them, in this transitional time, I've been working with fabrics and textiles. This is a recent piece I made in March. Megan, you so inspired me. I was like, what did I do in COVID? This is what I was doing in COVID, or parts of a process of a long extended process. But I've been dyeing fabrics to the color brown. And so a lot of that, I didn't say that out loud, I apologize. The stained glass often was the color of skin that I know, right? Of Black and brown people's skin. And so I took that same process to learn how to dye fabric to brown using lots of different colors, and then learning silkscreen and printing and doing a lot. It's a whole nother lecture, but this is the work that I'm focusing in on currently, which really sort of continues that same questioning of perception, of color, of situational color. It's just taken out of the photographic language and moved to one of fabric and craft. So with that, I'm gonna pass I think that's within a time limit. I'm gonna pass this along to Joni and let her have a spin.
Thank you, Myra, that was really great. Oh, I think you might be on mute, Joni.
Okay, can you hear me all? That's better. Myra, that was fantastic. It was really interesting to learn a lot more about your wet plate collodion work. And since I've been involved with wet plate collodion way too long, it was really nice to see like a whole different point of view. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm really thrilled to be here with Megan and with Myra and with you, Maria. So yeah, okay, I'm gonna share my screen now. Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm just having a few little glitches. Can you see it? Yeah, okay, all right, slideshow. Okay, so welcome everybody. So I've been using large format photography and working with wet plate collodion for the last 20 years. I became so enamored with the wet plate process and just so excited by all of its elements, the object quality, like Myra described, pictures you can hold in your hand, the detail, the tonal range, the variety of substrates, the immediacy of the process. And let's not forget the vintage lenses and the wet plate lifestyle. That's a whole other lecture too. However, it took me a good long time to become comfortable enough with the chemistry to go out in the field and also to find the right project for it. I began locally. So this is a picture tintype from Red Hook, Brooklyn, looking for, sorry, this is like on its own time frame, looking for subject matter and a way to connect the process to the changes I saw in our environment. Specifically looking at the end of industrialism and how to discern and better understand our past in the built environment. Since 1999, my focus has been ocean-centric. So I continued by combing the edge of land and sea and found plenty to work with there. My project Abandon took me from Maine to Georgia and later out west. Exploring the history and architectural remains of slave ruins was not something I anticipated or knew much about when I arrived in Savannah in 2004. When in the field, chance plays a significant role in shaping the subject matter I explore and the people I meet. Ironically, I found this ruin in an upscale housing development. My time spent in Georgia and on the barrier islands I visited frequently relied on, as they say in the South, the kindness of strangers. The ferry to this island didn't allow cars, so my assistant and I hauled all of the gear on the boat and hoped we'd find someone with a truck to help us out on the other end. Chocolate is a collection of tabby ruins begun in around 1810, constructed by enslaved people on Sapelo Island. Most of the structures are in very bad shape, even though some have remained for over 2 centuries. The slideshow is getting a little ahead of me. I went to Western Utah in 2008 as an artist in residence for the Center for Land Use Interpretation, where they described the surrounding landscape as not the romantic West. I did not believe them. It wasn't until I was living in a tiny trailer at the edge of an abandoned Air Force base that I got the message. Exploring the Western landscape with the large format camera and wet plate collodion was just so exciting. I took it on as a kind of calling and a way for me to connect and converse with the history of photography and with our 19th century forebears. On the left is a photograph of my assistant, Christine, on the salt flats of Western Utah. And on the right, it is Nicholas Sparling, Roger Fenton's assistant in the Crimea. The wet plate wagon offers another glimpse into the entire process. And the wet plate photographer's kit is unlike any other, as many of you may know. It involves chemistry you can't fly with, so you must acquire everything on site and build your dark box and make your kit up on the spot. So it was these travels that gave me my successes and my failures that enabled me to get comfortable enough working in the field to begin the project Surfland. Surfland is a series of large format and ultra large format wet plate collodion tintypes of surfers that spans over 14 years and expanded to 14 continents. It began at my local surf beach in Montauk, which you see over here, and it quickly grew to be a global project that was enabled by the revived interest of collodion practitioners all over the world. Working outdoors and processing my plates on the beach with a portable dark box involved multiple elements, like Megan, chance, spontaneity, weather, time and tide. Not only was I shooting with a large format camera, viewing my subjects upside down, I was also a spectacle myself. I was in public and thus part of a public performance. Surfland involved close contact with the surf world, which I knew nothing about when I began making these pictures. However, my subjects were very interested in having their photograph taken, and they were very active in guiding me through the portraits as well. This next video shows my subjects in France watching the plate being fixed in the fixer bath. Here we go. Yeah.
Regardez bien la photo. Vous allez voir l'inversion que ça va faire au bout d'un moment. Voilà.
Fixing the plate is the highlight of all of my photographic exploits on the beach, and it is just such a great moment. Sorry, this is now just repeating itself. Okay, let me go to the next slide. Here we go. This is another video of me making a still photograph for a film, The Women and the Waves, with the filmmaker Heather Hudson. And this is just a short little video she put together. And that brings us to the conclusion of my slide presentation. Let's see if I can unshare my screen.
Oh, thanks, Jenny. These are all so great. I mean, we brought you together because we saw overlapping themes even before this, but now hearing all three of you talk, I'm really impressed by duration, both the duration of making. I mean, all of you are doing such labor-intensive processes. So the duration of making it, and then the duration of the existence of the mediums. I mean, using cyanotypes and collodion and tin type process, you know, those are materials that have been around since the beginning of photographs. And then the fact of the duration of your final projects, which are, you know, one of a kind, unique. That's not what you expect from photography. You expect that you might be able to get multiples. So I love that they're unique. And then in Megan's case, you know, that yours are actively deteriorating. So the duration of those pieces is in question too. So anyway, just love that that's coming out so much in your conversations. I had just a few questions to pose to you guys, and then we can open it up to audience Q&As. But I was curious, what in general for all of you brought you to working with alternative processes? What do you believe that your specific technique that you're utilizing brings to the work that would be missing if you were using, you know, digital or film or some other kind of more standard? Okay.
Who's going first? Okay, well, I'll speak then. For me, working with alternative processes has been a long conversation with photography that I was interested in having since the early 1990s. I feel like using these processes and looking at photography from the beginning of time can inform a new way of looking at pictures and a new conversation that is important to have. So also, I feel like working with the process I work with, especially on the beach in public, is a way to engage with a community in a way I would never engage with if I were by myself, you know, on a bluff. So that's my answer.
I was fortunate to live in Rochester for a very long period of time. And my first teaching job was at RIT. And we took our students to the George Eastman House all of the time. And I'm not going to say that that's my first introduction to alternative processes, because I also went to UNM and was exposed to Betty Hahn and Tom Barrow, where Tom is still my hero. But at Eastman House, I met Mark Osterman and Francis Scully Osterman. Everyone who does the process is like, yeah, I know the rest of the story. They're mythical. They are unbound by history, and they can really just their romanticism with the processes really drew me in. And so it wasn't until that moment that I knew of that process intimately, even though I had seen it in books. And I love that feeling of seeing something in a book and not understanding it until you stand in front of it. And I really think that that is a process that happens with alternative processes opposed to film or digital. Like, I get it. But when I stand in front of those objects made at the beginning of photography, they actually render very differently. So I think those two things really attracted me to the process.
So for me, I actually started my series Literal Drift in a moment of utter failure, which I'm sure all of us are really familiar with that as alternative process photographers. But I had traveled to a beach in Hilton Head, South Carolina, with the intention of making images of bioluminescent jellyfish that are there. And, you know, these things happen. I showed up at the wrong lunar cycle. And when I got there, I had prepared all this time and all these materials, and I was ready to work in this way that I thought I would be imaging this shoreline, and it just didn't happen. And so that prompted my investigation into, okay, well, what materials did early practitioners use at the shoreline? And then I was like, oh, this is cyanotype. This is the material that showed our first like understanding of photography illustrating specimen from the shoreline. And so that got me interested in cyanotype. And then cyanotype has an interesting property that I exploit. So even properly washed cyanotypes have the potential to fade toward white and then to regain their density. And I'm sure some of y'all have heard this joke, like we say they need their beauty rest in the field. But you know, they'll lighten and darken. And it's a fascinating thing that they can be shifting in that way, even when they're properly washed. And I just wanted to kind of push the nature that already exists in that material, which is what landed me on cyanotype.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's like we rehearsed this ahead of time, but we didn't. My next question had to do with failure, because I knew the story for your background of why this started. And I know, Joni, you were actually intending to originally photograph the ocean and just bodies of water without the surfers in it. And then they kept coming through your shot. And that's sort of how you came upon shooting the surfers. So I was wondering if, with working with these processes, do you feel like you have to be more adaptive than maybe you would be, or looking for new opportunities sort of in front of you because of that?
That's a great question.
Maybe you have a failure story too, Myra, I don't know.
I have 1,000 failure stories. And working with glass there's a reason why tin is a lovely thing, and working with glass and watching it just shatter, you're like, this is poof, and it shatters in your hand. It's happened to me easily dozens of times. Glass is fickle, it doesn't like temperature change, doesn't like, you know, and then you pour hot tree sap on top of it to make them stable. And then you work over an open flame. Like, it's just failure. But
So Myra, I wonder if in the failure, and I'm sure Joni, you have some of this too, there's this certain kind of liberation in the practice where you're like, you go into it knowing things are going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And you have to welcome that in, or else you have to work with some other materials.
Well, it's the how many will I make today? If I make one, that will be a success. And some days you leave with 2 and you had any friend of mine knows when I'm working in these processes, if I leave with 2, I'm like, let's have drinks. This is the best thing ever, you know. But and then they still fail. But I mean, I think patience is what these processes require. I mean, they require, photography is known for immediacy, and it's really it's in its history, just not that at all. And Megan, you're on screen. I just have to say this one story. I was at, Barbara Caston had a show in Chicago, and there was a room of cyanotypes, and she walked in and she was like, they look so different. It was just this funny, like, oh, that's not where that stopped. And it was just this very interesting relationship to her body of cyanotypes in this beautiful room. But that's what your story reminded me of. So
love that.
Yeah.
In fact, I had a failure story that took place on the beach, where actually somebody who was helping me out was calling Mark Osterman to advise me why my plates were looking like hell. And and so this was a shoot that I just totally had to pack up and leave. And, you know, it's difficult if you fly out to a place and you get all your gear together, you mix your chemicals, you get there, and then boom, it's just very hard. But it's great because, you know, out of that failure, like, came so much information and so much connection with many other people.
Have y'all heard, oh, sorry, I jumped in.
And yet you
have y'all heard William Kentridge talk about the process of making his films?
No.
So he does these stop animation films that are made from his drawings, and he's changing the drawing in between each frame. And I heard him speak about the importance of the walking from the camera to make the drawing and the walking back to the camera, and how in those steps, some significant information about what he was trying to communicate or what he was thinking about would kind of bubble up. And so the process of the time and the labor put into it becomes actually part of like the conceptual underpinning that is holding up the work.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's really great. So in our exhibition, which I know Myra's been able to see, but I'm not sure either of the rest of you have, we highlight connections and influences between artists in the show. So for example, Imogen Cunningham purchased her first camera in 1901, only after seeing Gertrude Casimir's work. And then Louise Dahl Wolfe was inspired to start making photographic nudes and self-portraits only after visiting with Anne Brigman in 1921. So it's so great. Yeah, that's what we were excited about with this show, is trying to sort of show those connections that maybe people don't realize in the history. So my question for you all is, are there artists that you've looked to over time or were inspired by when you began working? And if not at the beginning, are there people who are working today that you're interested and inspired by?
Can I mean, I have to do the natural Georgia shout out to all those lovely ladies in the show. Sheila Pray Bright, who I met 20 years ago, actually in graduate school, and Jill Frank, who's working up at GSU. Like, the women who practice are also, even though the style and the methods are incredibly different, I think they are inspirations, and also just, you know, friends in the field. So it's nice to have those. I also lay my lineage down to Tom Barrow. I know it's a woman's show, but
We can let him go.
I mean, his Cancellation series really talks about like the surfacing of reminding you that you're not looking at a thing, you're looking at a photograph, you're looking through a thing to another thing. And just that thought in my early development as a photographer was really important to me. And so, yeah.
So in graduate school, Linda Connor became a hugely influential person in my life. And I sometimes call her like the photo mama of the Bay Area. Currently work that is stuff I'm really interested in. Erica Demon is doing these beautiful portraits where she's playing with three-dimensionality and making photographic portraits that she then renders as these slightly sculptural reliefs, and they're stunning and they're beautiful. I have several women in my critique groups who just keep me fired up and keep me on track. Aspen Mays, Teresa Gans, and Stephanie Lindsay. They're all making super interesting work. And I really appreciate the way that in a critique group, you can be vulnerable with each other and you can go to the ideas that are less than half formed and support each other through the making.
I want to join Megan's critique group.
Ditto.
Anyone come to mind?
Well, so when I first started making the Surfland series, I was very interested in the work of Via Selmans, and I was also intensely influenced by Richard Misrak's early 8x10 work. And so these are the things that I brought to making those portraits. And then, you know, like I have to say, you know, Julia Margaret Cameron is a huge influence, and, you know, all the women in photography, because, you know, when you're a woman and you're starting out in photography, you look to other women, Diane Arbus, I mean, all of them. So, but yeah, there's just so much incredible, you know, portraiture going on now. And it was just great write-up in the New York Times about Deanna Lawson last week. And it's just so great to see, you know, to see everything broaden, I have to say. I hope I can get to see the show. Not sure if I'll make it there.
I hope so too. It's open until August 1st so that everyone knows and has time to come see.
Can I just thank you for putting me next to one of my favorite Lorna Simpsons ever created on Earth. And it's just like an honor. And it's like, what do you just stand there like, and the security guy is like, why are you? And I was like, you don't understand, dude. Like, this is a moment I'm having. Let me have my moments.
They work so great together. I'm glad.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'll ask one more small question because I think you all almost addressed it fully in your talks, and then we'll turn it over. But so in Underexposed, again, referring to that, there are artists who were establishing their artistic practice within the home, whether that's experimenting with processes or directly turning to their surroundings to make constructions. So we have a Jan Gruber, who's in 1980 making and photographing constructions out of kitchen utensils and other household items. Or we have Sarah Hobbs, who's an Atlanta-based artist working today, who creates these really elaborate installations in her own home and then photographs them, and they kind of represent emotions and phobias and sort of obsessive compulsive activities. So my question originally was, did pandemic time, being at home all the time, inspire new ways of working? And I know Joni and Megan, you both addressed that a little bit, and Myra with your fabric work as well. But since so much of your work has to do with, specifically Joni and Megan, traveling elsewhere, do you think there's anything that you've taken from this time that you're going to continue to do in the future, or is it just get back to the field and be out and about?
From my perspective, I don't see like a return to the old ways. It doesn't seem like we're there anymore. There's been such a massive shift, hopefully in response to what we've all experienced here. So I've been working on a new series that I'm super excited about, where we take walks every day. Like a lot of people took, like that was the only break you could kind of get, was a walk every day. And so we foraged food, and I've been making prints from mushrooms that auto-digest themselves and turn into ink. And the way I've been thinking about these pictures is they're kind of fascinating because the spores that are left from the image making, these pictures could actually be used in the future in case of need. So someone could seed the earth with the spores to create edible mushrooms, or more romantically, an artist could grow mushrooms from my prints and then make their own ink so that they have materials in case of future need or future emergency.
That's incredible. Wow.
Thanks.
At the beginning of the pandemic, I started working, I was actually finished working on a book project called Surfboard. And I did my last shoot at the very end of January, beginning of February, and then began working on this book. So I spent a lot of time at the studio, walking to and from the studio. My studio is not my home. But the pandemic actually was a very, very busy time for me. And I just got a lot of work done and did a lot of things. It's just kind of incredible, weird, and maybe, feels not so great given everybody's suffering, but it's just, the way I coped here in New York City.
Myra, do you think you're going to continue on with your fabric processes, or do you see that evolving at any point?
I think what has happened, I think there's an evolution. I think I'm becoming more and more resource. Megan, this is why I'm really interested in what you just said. I'm really interested in resources. It takes a lot to dye and wash and do all this stuff with fabric. And then you watch Houston go, in a blink of an eye, people don't have water. And so then I have to reconsider, why am I using so much water as an individual? But I don't know what it means yet. I also, like Joni, stockpiled a ton of work, so I can sew for a pretty long period of time before these decisions have to be made, because a part of that labor was also therapeutic in the in the COVID times. So I don't know what comes next. I know that there are projects I want to finish and iterations I want to finish with the fabric work that I know will come through this year, but then I don't know what comes next. And it might be a turn back to photography or to process. I'm not one who claims a lane. I just sort of go, and then I'm interested in this. And so we'll see where those interests lie when the fabric supply dwindles.
Great. Well, I think we'll open it up to Q&As now. If anybody has any, feel free to drop them into the chat. We have one from Michelle. It's interesting how Megan refers to collaborating with the natural elements as opposed to using them. It implies an empathetic respect for the materials. Wondering if that can be unpacked a bit and if Myra and Joni feel similar about their processes or not.
Should I start, or do y'all want to? It's kind of directed to y'all. Yeah, it's a great question.
I mean, I think that's how I'm thinking about resources. I don't use natural elements besides my body. So therefore I think about resources. I think we're learning that we are not limitless, and we have to take that into consideration. And I think the COVID times has taught us about limits. But I'm going to pass this to Megan. I'm going to stop talking because I'll just.
I think that's an astute observation that I do find myself in an empathetic relationship with with what's around me. I find a very problematic worldview in this sort of notion of like control over. And we see that between people, and we see that between humans and the environment. And it's an exercise in futility to think that we can dominate the environment or have healthy relationships where we're dominating other people. And so I choose the word collaboration because it speaks to the way it goes down in the field. I'm not fully in control of what's going on there. I'm making decisions, right? When to put the paper in, when to pull the paper out, how to move through the landscape. But I really embrace the opportunity to relinquish control and to operate in an empowerment with the forces that I encounter out in the landscape.
I'm in total agreement with Megan. Every time I'm in the field, it's all about the loss of control and how to deal with the loss of control, because we're just here. We can only bring, our tools and our brains and our hearts to the place we're photographing, and then we interact and we see how it goes. And if we are too controlling, it doesn't work out.
I really admire all of you. As somebody who likes control, this is very impressive to hear. Somebody is asking if you could describe your creative satisfaction from making work that cannot be sold as multiple prints.
If you want to see the thing, you got to go see the thing. That's it. I learned that with a Picasso painting. I learned that I've learned that through other art forms. Mm-hmm. Is that if you want to see the real thing, people are willing to do that. And they do it if you want to see a performance, you see that performance. So I don't see it. I think it's weird that there would be multiples on the earth, not just a single item, but that's.
Don't believe in twins?
I mean, okay, I'll give you, but they're not the same item. They're a version created from the same source. But that's my, that's the New Yorker who grew up around a lot of museums and will go to see the thing. Yeah. I understand that not everyone is privileged to be able to go see that thing. Or those things might be in far-fetched places. People do it.
Well, photography has been so much about the multiple, so much about paper, so much about, vintage, you know, historic, original. And so to make, back, you know, in the early 2000s when I started working, to make these kinds of individual objects that you could hold in your hand, you could move them in the light, was, to me, a way to just break out of all of the boundaries of everything I'd learned in school. So that's how I think of it.
I think I'd build on that by saying that it seems all of us have an interest in pushing back against these kind of tropes or accepted notions within the field of photography. And of course, early on, photography was not multiples, and then it went into multiples. And so for me, it was kind of instinctive to push back against that idea that it had to be something we could repeat.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, a final question. It's kind of in jest, but I think let's take it into actual direction. Somebody wants to know if Megan's crit group takes new members. I'll broaden that a little bit. Yeah, exactly.
I want to get in there.
Yeah, and two.
I'll broaden that a little bit because I think I get that question from a lot of up and coming photographers of, you know, how do you find these groups of support and who do you talk to about your work to be able to sort of further develop it? Do you have advice for people who are maybe, you know, trying to figure out how to get that feedback?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I've got a few different crit groups going from people on different coasts, people with different interests. A lot of my relationships came from school. And a lot of them are long-standing relationships, like people that I met in 2004. And so we've been, you know, building trust and being vulnerable with each other for some time now. So for first piece of advice would be like, absolutely build your artistic community. And I don't mean that like network, I mean that friendships. Meet people that you can have the conversations with, the nerdy photo talk, the really freaky stuff where you're like, I'm scared to show this to anyone, like share your secret ideas. So like build those friendships, always constantly be looking for people who you can engage in that way. And then I would say that my critique groups, we do have guests, artists all the time. So I think that can be a really cool way to meet people that you may be like, wow, we need to start our own critique group, you know? So I think it's a community building exercise.
I think that trust and vulnerability, what you said, is crucial. For me, it's also talking to non-photographers, right?
Yeah.
And because we can spin a ball, right? but that perception comes from a certain language that we've learned, and that language may not be universal to all viewers. And I think it doesn't even have to be an art sharing group. It can just be like a good friend. Yeah. Look at this and talk to me about it. And so I think, but it requires trust and vulnerability. So I totally agree, Megan.
Joni, any other thoughts?
Shame on me for not forming a group sooner. That's all I can say. You know, I don't know what or why I have not ever done that, but I think it's time.
Well, on that forward thought, I want to thank you guys for such a wonderful and delightful conversation. This was great. And thank you to all of you who joined us here tonight. This has been lovely. Any final words from you three before we wrap it up?
Just thank you. Thanks for the show, and thanks for the panel, and thanks to the other artists.
And once again, Underexposed will be on view through August 1st. So please come check it out. We're very excited about it. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Lovely meeting you all.
Great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Myra.